It was really quite shocking, and I think it demonstrates the degree to which actually Moscow's control over particularly the North Caucasus region, which is predominantly Muslim and includes, for example, the region of Chechnya, where Russia actually fought two wars in order to prevent it from breaking away. It is clear that there is an issue there, and there's been all these various rumors. There's clear support for the Palestinian cause. And even though the authorities have been trying to clamp down on that, I mean, it's almost impossible, for example, to publicly protest in support of Palestine at the moment. But nonetheless, this crowd of hundreds, maybe even more than 1,000 people, who swamped the airport at Makhachkala, the capital of Dagestan, because they had heard that there was a plane from Tel Aviv coming in, and there was all these rumors that it was resettled Israelis and such like, really showed, I think, the limitations of the state's control.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hanson, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Galeotti, Honorary Professor at University College London. Mark, thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Oh, good to be here.
I want to start by talking about the situation in the Middle East and to what extent Vladimir Putin will see that as an opportunity, particularly with regards increasing attacks on Ukraine.
Well, look, I mean, obviously it is an opportunity, because anything that, as he would say it, distracts the West, gets attention focused somewhere else, is clearly to his advantage. Because from his point of view, his only real chance of being able to wrest some kind of triumph from the jaws of defeat in Ukraine is actually if the West loses interest in spending what is, after all, billions of pounds, dollars, and euros every month in keeping Ukraine standing and the war going. So yes, from his point of view, every consignment of shells, for example, that gets provided to the Israelis by the Americans is a consignment of shells that's not being given to the Ukrainians. However, it's not quite as straightforwardly positive as that. What this really has demonstrated is the degree to which Putin doesn't really have much traction on the process. He liked a situation of constant low-level tension so that he could basically play every side off against every other, because he had pretty good relations with the Israelis. He was getting better relations with the Saudis. He was metaphorically in bed with the Iranians. He had Syria as part of his dominion and such like. Now, though, he's having to actually make choices. He's having to come off the fence. And because he basically needs Iran for the military material it provides, and he needs to have a good relationship with Saudi, because between the two of them, they can largely dominate global oil prices, he's essentially having to ditch his good relationship with Israel. So I think from his point of view, it's got opportunities, but it's also got costs.
Yeah, we know that Sergei Lavrov, obviously Russia's foreign minister, has been in Tehran in recent weeks. What about Russia's relationship with Hamas specifically?
I think it's possible to make too much of it. Look, from the Russians' point of view, Hamas is one more player. As far as we're concerned, it's a terrorist organization. Well, of course, it is a terrorist organization. But let's be perfectly honest, different countries talk to different terrorist organizations. From the Russians' point of view, they've maintained a relationship with Hamas because it's necessary in order to give them some kind of influence, particularly in Lebanon. They recently had a delegation from Hamas come to Moscow. And clearly they're also talking to Hamas about the Russian nationals who are amongst the hostages that have been taken. There's no great signs of any particular sort of engagement between the two. I mean, Hamas is essentially Iran's proxy rather than anyone else. So the Russians will talk to them and they will use influence when they can, but it's not actually as if they really have much control over Hamas. And certainly there's no evidence at all that they even knew, let alone had a part in the horrific terrorist invasion of Israel.
So just bring us up to speed, Mark, if you can, with what's been happening in relation to the war in Ukraine, in particular the Russian attacks on places like Avdiivka, since the conflict in the Middle East escalated, because a lot of attention will have been on the situation in Israel and Gaza. What's been happening in Ukraine?
It's clear that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is beginning to wind down as we get closer to the really sort of heavy autumn-winter rains that basically make major offensive operations much, much harder. But it doesn't mean that they've stopped. And so what the Russians have been doing is they have launched a very, very significant sort of local offensive of their own in the region of Avdiivka, which is a town which is quite close to the city of Donetsk, which is one of the sort of the main focuses of Russian control in the Donbass region. So they're trying to push Ukrainian forces back so that they can't shell Donetsk. But perhaps even more importantly than that, what they're trying to do is draw Ukrainian reserves away from the south, where the Ukrainians have been making their main push. So it's almost like they're just trying to stop there being that kind of last minute, last minute goal in the closing stages of a game. This thought that the Ukrainians might actually try one last push to make up further ground before the offensive sort of stops until the spring. And so this, in a way, this is really what Avdiivka is all about. So, it's clear is essentially that the counteroffensive is coming to its closing days, and the Russians, just like the Ukrainians, are seeing what last territorial gains they can make before they basically have to hunker down for the winter.
Just zooming out a bit and looking at the bigger picture, would you say now that we're at a stalemate in the war?
Stalemate's it's a difficult word. It's one that actually people try to avoid using because it implies something much less dynamic. I mean, look, the Ukrainians continue to have offensive capabilities, and the Russians have demonstrated that they can, on a very local level, continue. So it's not like we're actually reaching that stage where basically the lines have been drawn and they're not going to move. There will be constant back and forth. What we can say, frankly, is that this counteroffensive has been much less effective than the Ukrainians hoped and expected, and indeed as did the West. But it's not been a failure. They have also sort of tied up and destroyed a lot of Russian forces. And more importantly than all, look, this was never going to be the offensive that wins the war. This is going to be a long, hard slog. What the Ukrainians have demonstrated is that they can metabolize the Western kit they're getting. They can incorporate it into their own activities. And when spring comes, and it'll be time again to launch the next round of offensives, the Ukrainians will probably be in a better position to launch it than they were this year. So I think it's more that you might say all wars come with periods of movement and then lulls. And this is one of the lulls rather than anything else.
I suppose if you're President Zelensky, though, the concern is that what with the situation in the Middle East, that Western attention will be drawn elsewhere and that some of the support for Ukraine may start to ebb away. That's already been a concern over recent months. How much stock would you put in that, Mark?
Look, I think it's by no means an empty fear. The bottom line is this is an expensive war. And frankly, many Western countries went into it believing that we were talking about 6 months, maybe 12 months. And now we're having to talk about 2, 3, 4, maybe more years. And in that context, I mean, it is clear that there is Ukraine fatigue growing. Everyone claims not. In the public statements, everyone says that their will is as unified and as determined as ever. As soon as you start talking to people off the record, though, I mean, it's very, very clear, especially, frankly, in continental Europe, that there are countries who are really looking for ways out if they could possibly get away with it. So much is really going to depend on what happens in the American elections. Because at present, it's very difficult for any country to begin to backslide, knowing full well that you will, in the process, going to be breaking the alliance in effect. On the other hand, if we start to get, whether it's under Donald Trump or someone else, the United States looking much more unimpressed with the idea of continuing this conflict, then it becomes so much easier for other countries to essentially use that as their excuse to do the same. So I don't think we're anywhere near the point where actually the Western unity will break yet. But on the other hand, the Israel crisis and looming elections next year in the United States, there are good reasons for the Ukrainians to be worried. And conversely, it keeps giving Putin hope. I mean, at present, although things have gone really badly for him, from Putin's point of view, there is that thought, well, if we just hang on a few more months, maybe just one more year, and things will get better. So long as he thinks that things are just over the horizon are much more rosy for him, he has no reason to scale down the war, let alone get involving himself in negotiations.
If Putin does indeed think his best strategy is to play the long game, hope for a Trump presidency again after the next US presidential election, then that makes sense on paper. However, it does bring in some rumours we've had in recent weeks, and I don't know how much credence you would give them at all, Mark, about Vladimir Putin's health. Indeed, even some suggestions last week that Putin may have died.
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously I've been a Russia watcher, well, frankly, since before there was actually a Russia, while it was still the Soviet Union. And the thing that really strikes me is, look, the Russian political system has always been a bit of a black box. There's always been so much that we didn't really know about particular leaders and policies and such like. However, that box has got blacker than ever under Putin, especially, shall I say, late Putin. We know so little about his whereabouts at any particular time, about who he's talking to, as well as, about his health and such like. And so we shouldn't be surprised that basically gossip fills this information vacuum we have. And at the moment, there's a particularly sort of bizarre trend towards believing what are, frankly, very dodgy anonymous Telegram social media accounts that claim to have some extraordinary inside access that they can tell you not just that Putin is dead, but how he died and at what minute of what hour he actually was pronounced dead. Very, very questionable stuff. But I think the fact that so many media outlets are happy to run with this, apart from saying some possibly not so flattering things about journalism these days, in some cases, obviously not the Times, but some other outlets that basically are just desperately looking for good, sexy copy. But beyond that, I think it does demonstrate a kind of almost desperation, because there is this feeling that without Putin, things could well be much better. And frankly, I think that actually, yes, without Putin, there's a greater chance, for example, of peace in Ukraine. So everyone wants to grasp at straws. And the prospect that maybe Putin is on his deathbed or about to be debilitated by some illness, it's all very tempting. But we should remember that last year, the director of the CIA, who we should assume knows a little bit more than just some anonymous Telegram account, said that, unfortunately, Putin seemed to be in robust good health.
Yeah, because even before these rumours about him dying, there were all kinds of rumours about him having cancer and being seriously unwell. From your perspective, Mark, do you think that is just idle gossip and without any evidence, there's no point speculating on it?
Look, I mean, I think we do know that there are some health issues that are plaguing Putin. And remember, he's 71. We know that, for example, he's had long-term back issues. There's some suggestion that there may have been some brush with cancer. That said, though, there's no real evidence that, in fact, he is suffering from anything which is going to kill or debilitate him anytime soon. And therefore, for this reason, I think we should treat these with considerable skepticism.
Just to go back to how Russia will be viewing the situation in the Middle East, we've had in recent days the incident at Dagestan airport, which was shut down after anti-Israel protests. What did you make of that, Mark?
It was really quite shocking. And I think it demonstrates the degree to which actually Moscow's control over particularly the North Caucasus region, which is predominantly Muslim and includes, for example, the region of Chechnya, where Russia actually fought 2 wars in order to prevent it from breaking away. It is clear that there is an issue there. And there's been all these various rumors. There's clear support for the Palestinian cause. And even though the authorities have been trying to clamp down on that, I mean, it's almost impossible, for example, to publicly protest in support of Palestine at the moment. But nonetheless, this crowd of hundreds, maybe even more than 1,000 people who swamped the airport at Makhachkala, the capital of Dagestan, because they had heard that there was a plane from Tel Aviv coming in and there was all these rumors that it was resettled Israelis and such like, really showed, I think, the limitations of the state's control. And at first, they seemed to be paralyzed. They didn't know what to do. Then, of course, they moved in, and in classic Russian style, with a certain sort of heavy hand. We had the riot police going in. We had a number of people hospitalized, about 60 people arrested, probably more arrests to come. But it really emphasizes, I think, the degree to which it's not just in his international politics, but also domestically, that Putin is walking a bit of a tightrope. On the one hand, jihadism, militant forms of Islam, which obviously is only held by a minority of Russia's Muslim population. Nonetheless, it is actually very hostile to the Kremlin as well as to the state of Israel. And they really don't want to allow it to flourish. But on the other hand, Muslims represent 10% of Russia's population and a disproportionately greater amount of the Russian military, because there's more Muslim young men. And so nor does the Kremlin want to alienate them. So it's been trying to sort of walk a very fine line. But now I suspect we're going to see much more of a crackdown because this becomes a real security issue.
And to what extent, Mark, is there and has there been a problem with anti-Semitism in Russia? And how has the Putin regime dealt with that?
Look, Russia has, unfortunately, a very, very long, dark history of anti-Semitism, certainly going back well into the Tsarist era. Indeed, the very word pogrom, actually comes from the Russian. And we've seen it time and time again being mobilized. We had under Stalin a sort of a claim of the so-called doctor's plot, that a collection of Jewish doctors were involved in a plot to murder him and other senior figures within the leadership and such like. However, there has been change. I think it's fair to say that, particularly if one looks at younger Russians these days, anti-Semitism is so much less of a factor there. And Putin himself, although of late he has dabbled a little bit with some rather sort of clumsy anti-Semitic tropes, actually he has been quite striking in his outreach to the Jewish community in Russia, but also towards Israel. He has a close relationship with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And, time and time again, he has clearly stepped on quite hard expressions of anti-Semitism within the Russian Federation. So, although it is still a problem, nonetheless, it is certainly much, much, much less of a problem than, say, 20 years ago.
I want to ask you, Mark, about the recent arrest of the US journalist Alsu Kamasheva, obviously following on from the arrest of our colleague, the Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich. Is this a tactic we can expect to see more of from an increasingly desperate Putin?
Unfortunately, it seems to be the case that Russia has decided two things. One is that it's going to be much, much more brutal and thuggish in its treatment of foreign journalists, especially American ones. But secondly, also that actually hostage-taking can be a useful tool of statecraft. Because what we're likely to see, after all, is certainly with Evan Gershkovich, is his being used in some kind of an attempt to trade him for, whether it's Russian intelligence officers or others who are in the hands of the Americans. So I think, it shows actually just how problematic, but also just how erratic the Russian policy is. Because it's not like they're going after every single foreign journalist. There are foreign journalists, including Americans, who are still able to go in and out of Russia, do their work, and do so essentially unhindered. But you never know. I mean, in the case of Kumasheva, it's because she was a joint Russian-American citizen, and they basically went after her for not registering that she had an American passport, and then for not registering that she was, in their eyes, what they call a foreign agent. In other words, someone who's ultimately paid for by a foreign state. She's based in Prague. She works for the American radio station RFERL, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And therefore, obviously, I think she was regarded as something of a representative of a media outlet that is a thorn in the Kremlin side. But there are other RFERL journalists whom they could have gone after. It's so capricious, and I think that's almost part of the idea. You don't want to have to arrest everyone, but you want everyone to think that they could be arrested, and that helps them either keep their nose clean or just keeps them out of the country. So, unfortunately, we probably will see further cases like this.
Just to go back to the situation in Ukraine, we've been talking about the importance of continuing munition supply to the regime in Kiev. In terms of supplies for the Putin regime, how would you assess their munition supply currently? We've heard reports. I think the Royal United Services Institute released a report recently saying they had seen satellite imaging suggesting that weaponry was travelling from North Korea to Russia. How would you rate the Russian supplies currently? Do they have enough to last over the winter?
Well, look, neither side has as much artillery ammunition, and indeed, it's also worth noting, new artillery barrels, because they also burn out over time, and that's another one of the sort of the absences. But neither has as much as they would like. But on the other hand, both sides have enough to be getting along with. The real issue is this. There's a certain level of artillery shells you need just simply to stay in the fight. But if you want to launch major offensive operations, you need a lot more. And that is in some ways the question. Probably for the next year, we will likely see the Russians outproducing the West. Now, the idea is that in about a year's time, a whole variety of new initiatives will have come on stream, and there will be a lot more artillery ammunition around. But certainly, we're likely to see that the next year is going to be one in which the Ukrainians are going to have to be rather more parsimonious with their ammunition, which might well limit their opportunities to carry out offensive operations and another counterattack. Whereas the Russians will probably be relatively okay. As I say, not as much as they'd like, but certainly enough to be getting along with, because really the Russian economy is moving into a full wartime footing. We're seeing arms factories essentially operating on 24/7, multiple shifts and so forth, churning it out. And this is one thing that, after all, an authoritarian regime can do. It can quickly reorient its economy to the needs of the war. And that's what we're seeing.
Interestingly, Ukraine has said recently that it successfully hit Crimean air defense technology. We've spoken a lot about the situation in the Black Sea as well, with the Black Sea fleet. What do you make of that, Mark?
I think what is demonstrated is that obviously the Russians do not have the kind of air or indeed sea defenses which can keep out all the attacks. And particularly now that the Ukrainians are getting more and more sophisticated Western kit. We know about the American ATACMS missiles. There's also the Storm Shadow missiles that Britain has provided. These are actually quite effective in penetrating Russian defenses. But they're not in and of themselves war winners. They clearly mean that Crimea is no longer what we might think of as a safe haven for Russian forces and Russian ships. One of the reasons why quite a few of the ships from the Russian Black Sea Fleet have been moved from harbors in Crimea to further eastwards to Novorossiysk, and there's talk of a new naval base being established on the Abkhazian coast. So they're clearly having to respond. But this is the point. This is really how wars work. Actually, one side demonstrates some new capability or some new tactic, and they hope to get some advantage, but probably the other side will then adapt. The Russians have demonstrated themselves in their own, sometimes clumsy way, actually quite adaptable. And so, yes, this represents the fact that the Ukrainians now can reach out into Crimea, and that will have an impact. It'll have an impact politically on undermining the Putin regime's claims that Crimea is essentially a safe bastion for Russians. But on the other hand, although it will have an effect on the military, it doesn't, for example, mean that Crimea is exceedingly vulnerable now. Crimea would still represent a very, very tough target for the Ukrainians to take back through direct military action.
Because there are those analysts who say that really Crimea is the crucial territory in this war, and that were Ukraine able to make progress on Crimea and strike Crimea, then that would potentially bring about the end game.
Yeah, but we don't know what the end game is. I mean, I think the problem is this. Let's be honest. Russians, ordinary Russians, most Russians don't really care about the Donbass. They don't care about any of these regions of Ukraine that are either occupied or currently in contention. They do care about Crimea. Crimea is a territory that most Russians, regardless of whether or not they are convinced supporters of Putin or indeed despise him, but they all believe is rightfully Russian. And in that context, I suspect that Putin thinks that the fate of Crimea is an existential political one for him, in the sense that he probably could not survive politically if he lost Crimea. Taking back Crimea in 2014 was in some ways his one true achievement. So I think that if it looked as if Ukraine was in a position to assault Crimea or even take it, that is the kind of thing that might force Putin, panic Putin, into some kind of extreme response. Now, we worry about him turning to nuclear weapons. I still think that's highly, highly unlikely. But he does have other escalatory options, including just simply mobilizing a lot more Russians. I mean, it's worth noting that although the Russians have taken more casualties than the Ukrainians, proportionate to population, the Ukrainians have suffered more. So there's still a lot more Russians that, if need be, could be forced into arms as not very happy, not very well equipped, badly trained troops, but troops nonetheless. So I think this is why Crimea is going to be the crux, because absolutely it is militarily crucial. It is central to power projection in the Black Sea, but it is also politically very vital. And there's a lot of people, frankly, even people in Kyiv, who wonder if there's ever going to be some kind of a peace negotiation. Crimea will actually end up being part of those negotiations as a bargaining chip. That it may well be that Ukraine doesn't really want to go after Crimea, especially because there's a large population there that actually want to be part of Russia. But instead, because that is so valuable to Putin, they might be able to bargain for much more concessions elsewhere as a result.
Just finally, Mark, as we move into November now and we're approaching the end of 2023, has this year on balance been a good year for Vladimir Putin? Certainly compared to the failures of 2022, with the full-scale invasion not going as originally planned. He's seen off the threat of Prigozhin. The Ukraine counteroffensive hasn't gone so well. Now we've got the ongoing situation in the Middle East. Do you think he will look back at this year and go, actually, on balance, hasn't been a bad one for him?
I think politically, just as militarily, in some ways, I think Putin feels that he wins by not losing. I mean, you're absolutely right. This year could have been a hell of a lot worse for him if the Prigozhin mutineers had actually got to Moscow, if there hadn't been this terrible crisis in the Middle East, if the Ukrainian counteroffensive had punched all the way through to the coast of the Sea of Azov. All of those things would have been that much more serious for him. So, yes, he has. Let's face it, Putin's actually, his whole career has been one in which often he's actually been pretty lucky. And certainly this year he has dodged multiple bullets. However, one also has to recognize the degree to which he is continuing to basically bleed legitimacy away. His economy is slowly inching towards crisis, even if it is more resilient than many people had imagined. He faces elections next year, and look, yes, we all know what the result will be. I'm willing to call it. Putin will win. But the point is, elections are inherently destabilizing moments where you have to kind of create at least the illusion of some space for disagreement. And more to the point, if you totally rig them, that runs the risk, as has happened in the past, of triggering protests. So, I think that he may be moderately satisfied with how 2023 has gone. But that doesn't mean to say that there's looming, even beyond the resumption of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, a whole variety of future crises waiting for him next year too.
Mark, we always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us on Frontline today.